Right, this is one of a series of records I've got, which is the Columbia Gramophone Limited record. It's the International Educational Society, and it's Lecture 9, Part 1, Some Aspects of the 18th Century. Really interesting, this actually. It's already up on YouTube, but all you hear is the sound on that video. This is actually the gramophone playing on a wind-up gramophone. It's Professor G.M. Trevelyan, Professor of Modern History in the University of Cambridge. This is really, really interesting actually. It tells you an awful lot about the 18th century.
I propose to speak to you about England in the middle of the 18th century. Say about the year 1759, when George II was still king, when Clive was conquering Bengal and founding our Indian Empire, when Wolfe was driving the French troops out of America and making Canada British, when the elder Pitt, with his eagle eye and eagle's beak of a nose, kept all France and the English House of Commons equally in awe of him. Why do I choose that particular time? Not because of great men and great events that I have named, about which I do not propose to say another word, but because the reign of George II was the last period before the beginning of those changes in the manner of everyday life which historians call the Industrial Revolution. In George II's reign, the typical Englishman was still a tool-using animal living in the country. He has since become a machine-using animal living in the town. George II's reign was not only the last period of the old way of life, but it was in some respects the best. From the point of view of material welfare, the average man and woman in England had then probably more to enjoy and less to suffer than in any previous age. England was richer than she had ever been before, though of course very poor judged by our modern standards. Under Walpole and the elder Pitt, she was undisputed mistress of all the oceans of the world, and her commerce was bringing home wealth from every corner of the globe. She enjoyed a most unusual degree of peace and harmony at home, and when she fought France, she won the victory overseas at a very easy price. And so I think we can take no more favourable example of conditions of life before the Industrial Revolution than this of England in the reign of George II. Whether it was better or worse than the England of today is a matter on which opinions are sure always to differ. I make no pretence to determine the point. I only want to remind you of a few differences between that life and our own. And there are hundreds of other differences that I shall not have time to mention. Perhaps the greatest difference of all, the root of many other differences, was this, that the mass of the people of all classes lived a country life instead of a city life. Agriculture was the principal occupation of Englishmen. The 7 millions who inhabited the island had to grow their own food. The great sailing ships of the English mercantile marine brought back wealth and luxury of all kinds, but they brought neither grain nor meat. It was still as much as other countries could do to feed themselves without feeding us. Our island could therefore contain no more people than it could feed off its own soil. So Englishmen treated farming as the most important and the largest part of life and business.
Right, this is part 2 of this International Educational Society recording. It's a 78 RPM 12-inch shellac record. They did a series of these recordings started in the sort of late 1920s. This is probably somewhere around that period, towards the later 1920s. It's, as you've already heard from part 1, it's Some Aspects of the 18th Century, and it's Professor Trevelyan.
If we thought of the English, but we should make a mistake if we thought of the English village of George II's reign as a community devoted entirely to agriculture. It was the seat of industry also. Industry has since migrated to the cities, leaving the villages more purely agricultural than they were before, and poorer therefore in social life. In those days, the countryside manufactured many things for its own use. Besides the village blacksmith, there used to be the village makers of carts, saddlery, furniture, and many other objects of daily use. The local masons and thatchers put up and roofed the houses. There was no village shop or cooperative society piled up with goods from London or Manchester. No tradesman's cart from town called for orders every day. On the contrary, the village or the group of neighbouring villages made most of what they wanted for themselves. They had their own craftsmen and small manufacturers who sold the goods they made direct to their neighbours. All else was supplied by marketing expeditions to the nearest country town. There, no doubt, goods from London and abroad could be purchased. You must remember the condition of the roads. They were so bad that there was very little wheel traffic. Fish was sent up from the seaports to London on the backs of fast-trotting horses. Bulky goods, not only cloth, but even coal and crockery, were carried in packs slung across pack horses. The pack horses could trudge through the mire that often stopped my lord's lumbering old coach and six. The great coaching days of Pickwick's time, with 12-mile-an-hour slap-up coaches bowling along macadamized roads, was still far in the future. In George II's reign, coaches could seldom break into a trot. The little road improvement that was done by private companies who kept the toll bars. Riders and drivers on the road paid for going through the toll bar gates. But villages not only manufactured much for themselves. Many villages in 18th century England manufactured also for the national and even for the world market. In my own house I have a fine grandfather clock of that period bearing the maker's name, Churchill of Prior's Marston, a Warwickshire village of a few hundred souls, so small a place that you would not expect such fine work to be done there according to our modern ideas. In George II's reign, English cloth was carried by English ships to all parts of the globe, and this English cloth, the basis of our commercial and financial prosperity, was made not in factories, but by spinners and weavers working in their own country cottages. The unmarried woman was called a spinster because she supported herself by spinning, since her time was not occupied as mistress of the farm and family like her married sister. The children, too, were put on to spinning or other work in their parents' cottages at an age when they would now be in the lower standards of the primary school. The factory system of later times did not begin child labour. Child labour had existed from time immemorial in the parents' home from the time of the cave dwellers until the Industrial Revolution. Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, in his tour through England in the early 18th century, noted with pride and satisfaction that at Taunton and in the villages round it, every child above 5 years old defrayed the cost of its keep to its parents by its labour. Poor little things. But at least, whenever their parents let them go play, they had fields near at hand to run into instead of the boundless wilderness of slums.
Right, part 3 of this International Educational Society lecture. It's some aspects of the 18th century. Professor G.M. Trevelyan, Professor of Modern History at the University of Cambridge.
The typical Englishman then was a villager, but a villager accustomed to meet men of various crafts and occupations. By no means, therefore, a mere rustic boor, ignorant of all save the plough handle. Moreover, some people nowadays are inclined to forget that ploughing and agricultural operations generally are an extremely skilled trade. The ordinary crafts and occupations of men, whether agricultural or industrial, were probably more interesting on the average than the uniform processes of manufacture and organization in which so many spend their lives today. There was more variety and art and less narrow specialization in the work of the craftsman, the shepherd, and the small farmer then than in the work of the clerk or mechanic today. On the other hand, there was a much greater amount of heavy, back-breaking work which machinery has greatly diminished. Hours were very much longer. 13 hours a day was very usual. Food, clothing, warmth, washing, and all the comforts of life were far less widely diffused than today. Pain and illness and disease were uncontrolled. The doctors and nurses were few and incompetent, and anesthetics were not used. To set against all that, the natural pleasures and simple, wholesome interests of country life were at almost everyone's door. Life in factories and great cities may be a life less worth living than the old life in cottages and villages. The 42 millions in Britain today may have less interesting minds and characters than the 7 millions of George II's reign. I cannot say yes or no to that, because I do not know enough. Perhaps no one knows enough about either past or present to say with certainty. But this at least is certain, that life is more comfortable on its purely material side for the 42 millions than it used to be for the 7 millions. Because machinery has rendered available a much larger number of articles per head of population. Take, for instance, the important article of firing or fuel. The primeval forests having been used up, the poor 2 centuries ago had in many regions no fuel for their hearths. No fuel meant bitter cold and damp in winter and uncooked food all the year round. It meant, in fact, a bread and cheese diet. Those northern districts where there was peat to be cut on the moors were in this respect better off, and coal could be sent on horseback to the districts near the collieries, and by water to London, the towns on great rivers. But where there was neither peat nor cheap coal, nor ancient forests, that is, in a good half of England, the empty hearth was a terrible privation to the poor. The mental food of the average Englishman in the reign of George II was not supplied by reading, but by conversation. Probably not half the population could read. Newspapers had but little circulation and were rather news sheets than what we mean today by newspapers. There was no city-made newspaper of universal circulation to stamp a uniform mentality on the whole nation. Each county, each village had its own traditions, interests, and character. Today, men are interested in the political, aesthetic, and scandalous chronicle of the world at large, pervades them by city-made newspapers, not to mention the gramophone and wireless. Then, people had little to think about save the daily human drama of their own village amid its surrounding fields and woods, with its traditions, its ghost stories, its poaching affrays and smuggling adventures, the quarrels of its squire with its parson, its miller with its innkeeper, its neighborliness, its feuds, its shrewd, ignorant, rustic comment on the mysterious world beyond.
Right, part 4 of this superb International Educational Society 78 RPM shellac record by Professor G.M. Trevelyan. After all the documentaries we've seen on TV, you listen to this record and you'll have a better knowledge of the 18th century than all those, masses of documentaries and dramas, because he just uses a very small space within this record to bring together some of the fundamentals of that age, concisely.
Books were few and far between. There was no public library in reach of the ordinary man. At the hall, where the squire spent 6 or 9 months in the year, there was often a good English library and artistic treasures from abroad. But his chief interest in life would be shooting, hunting, and if he was a wise man, agricultural improvement. The parsonage, the doctor's house, or the house of some well-to-do manufacturer might also contain small libraries, and a clever village lad might get the run of the books of one or other of these patrons. But the ordinary farmer and cottager had no newspaper, no novels or story magazines, and no literature of any kind, except the Bible, and the broadsheet ballads nailed up over the fireplace, telling of Fair Rosamond, Robin Hood, and the babes in the wood. But in spite of, or on account of, his slight dealings with print, the cottager would have more stories, traditions, and shrewd imaginative talk of his own and his neighbours to retail. News and ideas from London and from neighbouring towns and shires were also brought to the doors of the village and to the lonely farm at the lane end by the coming and going of the middlemen manufacturers who employed the village spinsters and weavers, by the village craftsmen with their trade connections in the world beyond, by the pack horsemen and carriers, by the peddlers, gypsies, smugglers, and travelling showmen and quack doctors, and all the motley tribe of users of the old English roads and lanes. This village society lived under the shadow of the great house where the squire bore rule. It was a rule more paternal than tyrannical, and until the later years of the 18th century it was very little resented. Yet their government was, by our modern ideas, certainly open to criticism as a system of government. For the squires who owned the land also governed the countryside as justices of the peace. They were not elected, like the county councillors and rural district councillors of today. It was simply appointed by the central government. Government selected them, not so much for political reasons, still less because of their training or knowledge, but simply in consideration of their local influence and possessions. They were in fact the magistrates because they were the landlords. And as magistrates, as justices of the peace, they raised rates, made bylaws, administered the poor law, and performed the various duties of which the elected councils carry on today, insofar as those duties were performed at all. This was the method of government in the English countryside, a patriarchal form of government, suited to the age and to the society of that day, but destined to give place to something more democratic and more professional when the Industrial Revolution had come to make new worlds for old.